nerds, what's up? So, Andor was amazing. I loved every second of it, and I haven't been this excited to watch a TV show in a long time, like waiting for the episode to drop and immediately going and watching it. And so today I just feel like I have to talk about why I feel like Andor was such a successful TV show. Now, I don't want to rehash negative opinions I've had on a few other shows recently, but I couldn't help noticing and comparing what Andor was doing right that some of these other shows just didn't quite capture. And so today, as I talk about the success of Andor, I will be comparing a little bit to other shows and why they were unsuccessful to frame why I think Andor as a Star Wars TV show ended up succeeding so much, at least in my opinion. Now, I have already done a video on the first 3 episodes of Andor where I talk about their lack of use of mystery boxes and their efficient use of time to tell us so much about each character individually, using every second and every moment. So while the show continued to do those 2 things, I'm not going to recover those here. So if you're interested in those 2 things, you can check out my other video, which I'll link above, talking about that. So today we're going to talk about how excellently Andor did characters, how they nailed emotional moments, their pacing, and how they kept themselves true to Star Wars despite going into a slightly darker direction as a show. As a warning, this will be a full spoiler discussion. See you after the jump. I'd like to start out talking about the characters and focusing on a couple characters that I think they really nailed in ways that could have been difficult, but they kind of worked through it. And the first person I want to talk about is Cassian. Something I think they did really well with Cassian was walk that very precipitous line of making him extremely competent in many things, but avoiding making him a Mary Sue. Now, I would like to say that I use Mary Sue as a genderless term, so it could apply to any sort of character, not just female characters. And this is mostly because Cassian is extremely competent in things that make sense to us. We know what he's good at doing, but we also see that he's a mess in other places. He's haunted by his past, he has trust issues, he can overreact, and also act in ways that cause deep pain to others. So when he shows up and tells this unprepared rebel group, what in the heck are you guys doing? It makes sense. We know that's where Cassian shines, and it doesn't seem like he's just the answer to everyone's problems. We also see good characters who dislike Cassian, and so we don't feel like everyone has to react to Cassian in the same way, or that makes them bad people. Now, I personally wouldn't call Galadriel's portrayal in Rings of Power a Mary Sue. I don't think that's what it was, but I did sense a fear in their portrayal of her, a fear to make her unlikable in any way because then they were worried the audience would not like her. They kept shying away from leaning into her darker moments and instead had every character who didn't like her be bad or wrong and every character that liked her end up being good or right. And you just don't need that to make a character likable, and I think that's why Galadriel ended up falling so flat. I think we care about Cassian because we do recognize that he is flawed, and people like flawed characters. Let's talk antagonists, which I also think they did extremely well, and I want to start off with Meero. Meero is working for the Empire, and the Empire is doing really bad things, right? We see that they are doing really bad things, so why am I sort of like, yeah, you go, girl. Why do I want to see her succeed? I'm like, yeah, you beat that annoying coworker. I'm rooting for her. And I know I've talked about Karn, but I also continue to like him this entire season. I was so invested in both of their stories. And I kind of sat here trying to figure out why were these antagonists so much more successful for me, and I think I came up with a few reasons why. So if you don't know, the Rings of Power showrunners said that they hope to make Sauron in the future a complicated bad guy in the vein of Walter White. They want people to root for someone doing really bad things. They want him to be a complex bad guy. Now, I've already talked before about how stupid I think that is for the character of Sauron and his history in Lord of the Rings, but let's put all that aside for a second. Let's pretend that this is what we want to do and we're going to do it. Were they successful in season 1 of Rings of Power? And my opinion is no. They were too worried about making him likable. They were too worried about making him almost like a good guy so that you would like him, which completely misunderstands why people root for villains. First of all, people love villains all the time. There are a ton of famous villains that people get behind, even if they're doing terrible things. But I think the key is that you don't shy away from what makes them a villain. No one's shying away from Karn's bad decisions or Meero just like actually working for the bad guys, and that's what I think makes them likable. Meero is fun to root for because she's extremely competent. They've written her in a way that we can relate to what she's going through even if we don't agree with her. Like, we've all had that coworker, you know? And finally, they aren't trying to make her likable. They aren't trying to trick us into liking Miro. And I think we can see kind of the same thing with our failed Obi-Wan villain. They tried to make her likable with her backstory, tried to make her seem sympathetic, but her as a character herself wasn't compelling. She didn't feel like she had a lot of deep well to draw from. Compare with Karn, who makes the most wild bad choices, but I understand him. I understand his personal ethics. I understand his motivations. He's fascinating to me because I can tell he has a deep history. I've covered this a lot, so I won't retread, but the Obi-Wan character's actions never really made sense, and so I could never connect to her. Karn, even though he's making super bad decisions, I'm interested because I understand his personal motivations for what he is doing. Also, the actor just did a fabulous job. Props to him. Andor understands the way to make a compelling villain is to, one, make them like any other character, which makes them nuanced and have many personality traits, and also doesn't not try to shy away from their bad decisions, doesn't try to explain them away. It just lets them be and lets the viewers decide for themselves. Now, I'm going to move on from characters right now, but don't worry, we will talk about a lot of other characters later. I know I haven't covered very many of them. Personally, I felt like every character in the show literally hit its mark. I love them all, but I'm going to talk about them for different reasons. Next, I want to talk about emotionally impactful moments. All truly great shows, I feel like, have to have moments where it hits you right where it hurts, and I feel like Andor did an excellent job at this, and there's 4 in particular that were some of my favorite moments that I want to talk about, which include Never More Than 12, I Can't Swim, We Give All to the Rebellion and Take What's Left, and That's the First Untrue Thing You've Said. I'd like to note that in all of those moments, they were unsupported by slow-mo or dramatic music cues, and in fact, the words or moments themselves aren't poetic, right? I Can't Swim or Never More Than 12 have no meaning outside of the context of the TV show. They didn't need to rely on those kind of cheap tricks to make something feel like it had a momentous moment. Instead, they relied on their characters to drive the drama. I mean, the I Can't Swim moment, first of all, how dare you? And second of all, how dare you? I was emotionally gutted during that moment. I didn't see it coming, and I probably should have, but I was like actually upset. And yes, Andy Serkis absolutely served in the show, and everything he did was amazing, which I think also helped sell these moments. I think a lot of his moments are fan favorites, so I don't think I need to talk much about that moment, but one moment I haven't seen talked about as much that is probably one of my favorite moments of the show is this small moment between Val and Cinta where she says that we give all to the rebellion and take what's left. And this first scene is good on its own, right? We can tell that Vel is kind of gutted by that. She doesn't want that. She just wants to be with Cinta. Sure, she wants to fight, but can't it be both? And can't they put their relationship first? And the devastation and realization that the rebellion means more to Cinta is just so sad, and I love how the actress just portrayed this moment so well. So that moment's already good. But then Vel turns around and repeats the same line to her sister Mon Mothma in a way that makes Mon Mothma think that's just what Vel thinks and that's her own creation. And the symmetry of those moments where Vel is just repeating something she didn't want to hear in the first place, and then how that's going to affect Mon Mothma's decisions later and how that's spreading. Does that make sense? It was just such an emotional moment to me, and I loved that mirroring of, no one's really saying how they feel, and no one's talking, and this rebellion's kind of shrouded in secrecy. I don't know, I feel like that was a very emotionally well done moment, and what's so interesting is like that moment is not lingered on at all, right? It was just something I caught and then it moved on, and I just still wasn't over it. It's the same with That's the First Untrue Thing You've Said moment. It really makes us wonder if Mon Mothma is gonna actually stoop that low. I actually wasn't so sure when she sends him away. I actually thought that she was gonna hold her ground, and then he turns and says that phrase, and it's just so good because it really made me question, is she gonna do it? And then the punch at the very end of the show where it's like, yeah, she did it. Those are the character moments I live for. Those are dramatic because it's about inner turmoil, and it's not trying to be dramatic, it just is. Another thing I really appreciated that Andor did is not rely on cheap fake out moments to drive emotional tension. I complained at this at length in Rings of Power and Obi-Wan, how they tried to drive tension over the safety, the life safety of characters we absolutely knew were gonna be alive because we know they survive. And Andor never does this. It doesn't pretend Cassian's gonna die. We know he doesn't. It uses character motivations to drive the drama, not just life or death. And that's a sign of really good writing to me. Okay, next I want to briefly talk about pacing because I really loved it. Can we just, finally, they're giving back the 40-minute show. I just feel like everything has been so long lately, and things just don't necessarily need that long runtime. Look, I absolutely adored and loved Stranger Things Season 4, but there were several episodes that I did not think really earned their over-hour runtime. Some did, some just didn't. I felt like it dragged occasionally. Andor did not drag a single moment for me. Those 40 minutes were so packed from start to finish. There were actually episodes where the ending completely caught me by surprise because it felt like I'd only been watching like 20 minutes. I feel like Andor almost could have been longer, but I appreciate how committed they were to efficient storytelling. I also really loved how they ended up doing a 3-3-4-2 mini arc within the entire season. I think as a character-driven show that people can find to be slower, dividing it up into those mini arcs really kept the plot moving in a way that I think was very smart. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the themes of Andor. I think one of the hardest things about making new Star Wars content is that the original Star Wars movies hit this really fine line of being movies for adults that are still very appropriate for children. They're not necessarily aimed at children. They have things that are very appealing to adults, but they're pretty appropriate. It's not childish, but it's not overly adult either. Star Wars also deals very clearly with like good versus evil, light versus dark, hero versus villain, which is, I think, a lot of very famous properties do that. Like when we think Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, things like that of that nature tend to deal with that themes. The problem with those two things is I do think it's difficult to replicate, and I think Star Wars media recently has kind of had a tone problem. Now, I am not someone at all who thinks things need to be gritty or gray to be adult. That's actually like the opposite of how I feel. I will say though that I think making Andor slightly darker, slightly more adult in tone really served it. I think focusing on the complexities of the rebellion and not just saying like the rebellion was always like super great, perfect all the time, and showing that, yeah, when the rebellion was getting started, it was probably pretty messy and pretty gray. It works. Some of my favorite scenes that show this messiness is like when the insider at the ISB is like, I have a kid now, I want to stop. And Axis is like, well, that's too bad. Or when Guerrera said, we'll call it war, when they sacrifice some rebels without telling them. And of course, the scene at the end that I've already talked about a lot with Mon Mothma, who basically gives up her child when she said she never would. The rebels are playing dirty and it's not clean. However, go back to my further point. I think they stop it from going too far, from going too gritty. And I think the way they do that is reminding us that the Empire is a very evil force. We see that in this prison, right? We see it in how Cassian has to deal with those things and how we see them slowly taking over every single planet and taking away autonomy. And I also think they really brought that home in the last episode with Cassian's mom's speech. That was kind of like classic Star Wars in her calling to action against this evil empire. And I think it was a really nice balance of still trying to keep that original Star Wars feeling. The rebels are a good force. We are seeing the complexities of how people aren't perfect and aren't heroes all the time, but remember, it's still fighting for the right thing. And I think they just hit a really good balance there where they weren't trying to be too gritty and too adult as a TV show, but they have moved a little bit more into that. And thinking about that made me realize a key theme of Andor, and that theme is sacrifice. And the theme of sacrifice is seen a lot through the original Star Wars, and I think that's what keeps Andor grounded to that Star Wars feeling, even if they aren't chasing quite as much family friendliness. But every character in Andor can pretty much be summed up by sacrifice as a theme. Cassian sacrificing his freedom in the end and what he wants for finally realizing that he needs to work for the greater good. Marva sacrificing herself for what she believes in. Mon Mothma sacrificing her safety, her family, and ultimately her very morals. Vel and Cinta sacrificing their relationship. Karn sacrificing his job and maybe even his sanity for what he truly believes is right. Luthen sacrificing people in his own rebellion and maybe even his sense of identity. Kino giving a rousing speech even when he knew he could not escape himself, and everyone who gave their lives or sanity for what they believed. And so again, while this show is darker, I think focusing on a theme that is present in the original trilogy helps keep it grounded and not go a little bit too far. And I am wondering, a theme of sacrifice goes hand in hand very well with a theme of redemption, which obviously redemption is a key theme in the original Star Wars. And I'm wondering if we'll see more of a redemption theme in later seasons. I'd be very interested to see that. Let's talk criticisms, to be fair. To be honest, I have very few criticisms of the show. I think the criticism I've seen is that people have thought the show was too slow or boring. And I think if you went into the show expecting very action-oriented Star Wars, which it usually is, and not a character-driven show, I can understand that criticism. I personally absolutely loved this being a character-driven show. I felt that the character moments weren't boring at all, and they actually kept me quite on the edge of my seat. I was very thrilled by them. So like for me personally, that was not a problem. I would say the last episode, I was surprised that Andor and Karn didn't have more direct action in the show, particularly Cassian. I wish he had been more directly involved in the final episode. That would be my one complaint. But the show as a whole was just so good, and I'm so excited for where it goes that I really have very few criticisms. To be honest, I could talk about how much I love this show forever and ever, but I'd love to know what you think about the things I did talk about today, characters and themes and pacing and emotional moments, and if you agree that they were more successful than some of the more recent shows that have been put out, especially if we just think of Star Wars shows. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Andor. Please let me know below. I am so excited for season 2. As always, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.